Thank you all for being here today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded territories of the Stolo, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Thank you for being with us on such a beautiful Saturday for the series of artist talks for our exhibition Pursuit, which opened last night. I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers today. I'd also like, my name is Nicole Wonder. I'm the new public programming and music coordinator here at Griffin. So we have today a series of conversations. We will start with Pierre Coupey, who is an artist and editor based in Vancouver. Founding editor of the Capital Review. He currently serves on the Capital Review Contemporary Art Society Board. His work has received awards, grants, and commissions, including grants from the Council of Arts of Quebec, Canada Council, the British Columbia Arts Council, and the Audience Foundation for the Arts. In 2013, he received the Distinguished Arts Award from FANS. He was elected to the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in 2017 and formally elected in 2018. He has published several books of poetry, chapbooks, and catalogs, and exhibited in solo and group shows nationally and internationally. And here we'll be speaking about the postcards of his grandfather, Léon Coupey, on display here, in conversation with Lisa Baldissera, I'm sure most people know as well, director here at Griffin. Lisa has worked as an independent curator, consultant, and writer in curatorial roles in public art galleries in Western Canada since 1999. Including senior curator at Contemporary Gallery from 2014 to 2016, and chief curator at the Menlo Art Gallery in Saskatoon from 2012 to 2014. She was the curator of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Victoria from 1999 until 2009, where she produced more than 50 exhibitions of local, Canadian, and international artists. She holds MFAs in creative writing and art from the University of Saskatchewan and is currently a PhD candidate at Colson College. And she has been here since the fall of 2018. So I'd also like to mention that we have a series of other programs coming this summer along with the exhibition that all focus on different methods of care and construction versus contemporary society. So there is a whole program of events over near the door. Like this. But our next event is on Saturday, May 25th. So in the studio with our current artist residents, Adrian Norwood and Morgan. So please join us for that. And yeah, more details to come on. You're welcome.
What we're going to do is actually record all of these conversations, and so that way you'll see them on our website later. So there'll be a way to actually hear them again and spread the word if you liked what you heard today, and also to use it as a different kind of archive, a different kind of text, a different method for sharing knowledge. So a lot of, as Nicole was saying, looking at how we receive knowledge, how we understand these kind of subtleties of affect and being and proximity being together. So the actual event is called Proximities, which is what does it mean to actually gather in the same room? So much of what we're doing and working at is done at a distance now. What kinds of things can be produced when we actually still gather together in the same room, which can feel perhaps adjunct or maybe old-fashioned, but now is beginning to become a real space of solidarity, politic, and care. So that is a framework for what we're doing. And just such a pleasure to be here with Pierre and to have gotten to know all of these postcards, which were introduced to me by Reed Shear when I first started. And I saw some of the initial images and was absolutely astounded. And Pierre's been so amazing at sharing them and giving information about them. And also it's a bit of a journey for you in terms of discovering more about them.
It's continuing.
It's continuing. So yes. Hopefully each time they're shown, this is going to be the first of many. Each time they're shown, this will be the first of many. Thank you. Then we will learn more as they travel out there in the world. So again, this is the letters that are written by Léon, Maurice, Henri, Valérie, Jules, Évariste Coupey, who was born in Lille. You'll have to correct me.
Right.
And to his fiancée and then wife, Kate Hunt Barlow Coupey. And they were approximately 1890 to 1920 that this exchange
Roughly, yes.
takes place. And there are over 70 postcards in total.
No, there are more than that. I have about 98 of them now.
Okay, 98.
Plus all the drawings and sketchbooks and things like that.
Okay.
And then there are a few more that exist out
As
there in the
well.
world, and some that have been lost and stolen and what have you.
Right, and then additional drawings and things.
Exactly.
Archives.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really strikes me is that they lasted and that someone knew to save them and someone treasured them. So obviously Kate Coupey was the first person to see their value as these love letters. True. But I wondered if you could start by just telling us what you know about the story of Kate and Léon in terms of family lore.
It does start with Kate and Léon, and it's very strange, as you all know. It's very hard to find out what for most of us anyway, at least in my generation, what our parents did. I mean, they survived so much, and they went through the First World War, they went through the Depression, they went through the Second World War. And as I was just mentioning with some friends earlier, that generation didn't really want to talk about their past. They were, certainly my parents were here in Canada to make a new life, not to relive an old one. But I'm always thinking now of that wonderful painting by Paul Gauguin in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, that great big mural, which I'm sure you all know. Qui sommes-nous, d'où venons-nous, et où allons-nous? Who are we, where do we come from, and where are we going? And, in terms of the great big cosmological picture, that's one element. Which obviously we're not here to grasp today, but then the smaller one of our individual family histories, which are so often buried, lost, forgotten, unrelated. And in terms of these postcards, and my grandfather, Léon, my father never showed us these, while he was until he retired, when he was in his 60s. So he was so busy with his business life that he wasn't looking back. He didn't have the time to do that. But then he began to bring a few things out, but we didn't see the whole extent of them until very recently, and it's largely due to Reed's intervention as well. But obviously, my grandfather was born in, just to give you the exact date, in Lille in 1864, and he died in Montmorency, Doyle-le-Bar, Angers-les-Bains. It's all the same little area outside of Paris. And he died in 1925 at the age of 61. My father would then have been 20, and he was in the French army serving with the cavalry, the artillery and the cavalry in occupied Germany after World War I. So he obviously left these to Kate. And then, of course, after Kate died, and Kate died in 1943, that's right, she died during the war, 1943, 1944, then they were distributed to my father, his brother, and his surviving sisters. So my father, Maurice, his brother, Raymond, who was the youngest, and then my aunt, Elise, who actually lived the longest of all of them by about 2 years. So when they died, then they were distributed to their children. And so my cousin Anik in England received a batch of postcards. Raymond's and his family, they distributed to their children. There are two still alive in France and one back in Montreal now. And then, of course, from my father, they came to me and to my brother. And my brother died, and he gave them to his 2 daughters, etc. So it's going to all go on, right? And now I'm trying to think, who am I going to pass them on when I kick the bucket? Which ones of your children are the ones that are going to be able to take care of them and value them? Anyway, that's another discussion. But so that gives you a little bit of a picture. And should I just carry on and babble, or?
Yeah, well,
Yeah?
I mean, I'm
Okay.
sure
All right.
we need to hear more.
So it's he was apparently a very interesting man, my grandfather, because he spoke 7 languages. He had won the first prize in the Paris Conservatory for violin, and he was a lawyer, although he didn't practice law until the very end of his life. And he spent 7 years in London, and he was inducted into the Japan Society in 1892 at the age of 28. And I've just learned recently, for a few weeks I've been puzzling with Lisa, what was he doing in London? How long was he there? Well, I've just found out that he actually worked for a bank in London, and at the same time he was the Reuters correspondent for Paris. And so part of his occupation was to read all the English papers in London in the morning, and then send a dispatch back to Paris in the afternoon. So apparently he was very gainfully employed, which
Where did he have
wasn't
time?
very, very gainfully employed later on. Don't mind me, I'm going to babble. I'm very nervous too talking about this, knowing that it's being filmed, and then that my siblings and all the family were going to check this out. I mean, what kind of lies is he telling now? But you got to fabulize family stories anyway, isn't that what they're for? So for me, the thing that becomes very interesting is that 2 Paris brothers, Léon, who was the oldest, and then his youngest brother, Évariste, were in London at the same time, and the 2 Paris brothers married 2 London sisters. My grandfather, Léon, was the oldest, but he married the youngest sister. Évariste, his brother, was the youngest, and he married Corinne, the oldest sister. The lead image that Lisa chose for the show, that cutout-shaped head with all the circular writing, was actually addressed from Paris to Corinne Hunt Coupey in London, and not to my grandmother. So the majority of the postcards are made by my grandfather, addressed to Kate Hunt when they were courting, both from within London and from Paris to London, and then afterwards during their married life. And for me, they are very much a celebration of the intimacy of their relationship and a kind of devotion he had to both Kate. He always called her Katie, my beautiful Katie, and I have all the portraits that he did of them at home. They're not in this show. And very much the joy he felt about, especially the birth of his first son, my father, Maurice, because in those postcards, the little baby in the swaddling clothes on the far left, and I have no idea whether they actually swaddled the baby still then. Maybe they did, horror of horrors, but that's my father. And then in the right-hand set, there are several that refer to my father there as well.
I've actually got the transcription here, and I really love the way, so that's the lead image, which is just the outline of the self-portrait.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a beautiful image, and he says, "My dear Corinne, you really must excuse me, but as I've taken the habit with the wish to subserve to the craving for postcards to make my correspondence in penny number, there are many subjects of the highest interest to all which escape my attention." Yes. So I think he's acknowledging that this has become an obsession for him. A passion and an obsession, exactly, that's right. And here is the self-portrait that is on the front of that image on the website. Yeah. And if you want to see them, you can go to my website, and they're up there. I've started a page, or a couple of pages for my grandfather's postcards and for his drawings. Yes. And there are a series of subjects that you started to look at, that there seems to be these sort of categories of things that he thinks about. So I wonder if you want to talk about what those categories are that you're noticing. In looking at the postcards and accumulating them, well, maybe I should just step back a second and talk about why we do have them here now.
I realized that, when I started looking at these postcards, that they really would be a thing of beauty for the whole family. So I began to ask them to send me the postcards. My original project was simply to do a self-published book so that everyone in the family could have a copy and see, as many of them as we could assemble together as possible. Then Reed Shire came over for a studio visit, and in leaving the studio, he saw that frame set above my computer in a different frame. We've reframed it for this show. And he took one look at it and said, "These are fabulous. We have to do a book." Well, that was 2 years ago, and the project is continuing. And then Reed introduced the project to Lisa, and Lisa came to see them. And so it could become a joint project between the two galleries and ourselves to actually do a publication that would reach beyond the family, and that, of course, is the ambition and the hope. So I began to ask all the rest of my siblings and the nieces and nephews and cousins to send me whatever they would. And my sister has some of the most beautiful ones, and she sent them to me, and the one that's used on the lead image is one of hers. But my sister is very attached to all her things, not only this one. Are you listening, Marguerite? And I had to send back the originals, and so I only have scans of those now. So that's why they're not in the show. Now, did I get far away from the question?
Well, you did actually, but that was still really great. But what I wanted to...
Okay, I passed.
But what I think is so interesting is there's sort of these streams.
Oh yes, the categories, that's right.
Addressing that are really fascinating.
That's right, the categories. So in beginning to see, getting an overview of them, and of course I haven't had them all scanned yet, and I haven't been able to read them all because my eyesight is not good enough without a magnifying glass to drill down to that tiny handwriting. Reminds me of the handwriting of Michael Ondaatje. It's just, so minute. But they fall into 4 categories. The calligraphy, which I think is quite astonishing, because clearly he's not trained in any of this. He's self-taught. The self-portraits and the portraits. Then the caricatures. And he very often caricaturized the postmen as pigs, because they always complained about the calligraphy and they couldn't read the address. And then the landscapes. And so there are those 4 categories. But I've realized now, again, in having them all together, that I can begin to track chronology where they are, not only by those that are addressed to Kate Hunt before they're married, but then when they're addressed to Madame Léon Coupey after they're married, but then by all the addresses. All the addresses in England and then all the addresses in Paris, such as, I think it's 19 or 9 Faubourg Poissonnière, the street of the fishmongers where my father was born. And then in my father's memoirs, he returns to some of these locations, but that's another story. Mm-hmm. So there are 4 categories.
What a wonderful project that would be to actually trace those addresses.
Well, I've started to Google map them, but of course they're very different now.
Right.
And until, this project has begun to take some momentum, I hadn't made it my business to go and visit those places in Paris. I hadn't made it my business to go and visit those locations in London. Now I will. Although the family home that my grandfather bought in Enghien-les-Bains at 9 Rue des Coutures was bought back by my uncle when he returned from Canada to France. And so I've actually lived in that house. And on Google Maps, it actually shows very nicely. And I'm going to read a few passages from my uncle and my father's memoirs, if I could. And the house is still very beautiful. And for the time, very unusual because it had a bathroom and indoor plumbing. And that was considered very chichi at the time. But Enghien-les-Bains ended up being a very chichi neighborhood anyway, because it is the only location outside of Paris that actually has a lake and a casino, and beautiful restaurants that border the casino, beautiful patisserie, and I had the best meal of my life at La Carpe d'Or. And I just have to make a little note of that, because never praise the food to the extent that I did, because the entire waiting staff was waiting around me when I finished, and they all applauded, and then brought out another serving, which I had to eat and love as much as the first one. I was sick for a few days.
Well, one of the things that, it sort of reminds me of is that one of the conversations we had was not only is this the charting of a love story, but the backdrop is another subject of care, which is the modernization of Paris that's happening at that time, and which is evidenced on some of the reverse images of the postcards, where you can see the rebuilding of the train station, for example, and then
and subway stations, metro stations.
Metro stations. Yeah. And so this is a time where the idea was emerging of public health, public care, and beatification as a public good. So that included parks and architecture. And it was kind of making good sort of a realization, beginning to realize the social contract that was initiated with the French Revolution.
Exactly.
And so this starts, with the outbreak of cholera in the 1830s, where there's suddenly an idea that we need to take care of the public health, take care of the public good in a much more organized fashion. But it also becomes a kind of moment of understanding the city as something to be proud of, and sanitization was part of that. You passed on that great podcast to me. So I wondered about how these ideals fit within this love story as you see it, in terms of those. Well,
that's pretty big.
Large
question.
It is a large question. Yeah. But I think it's interesting to think about structures of care. And so one of the structures that we all live in is the organizing structure of the city. The city produces gestures, behaviors, and relationships. And it's so beautiful to think of this infrastructure, the postal system, of which he's complaining, but that is carrying these messages of care to his fiancée from Paris, or even within the same city in London. Yes. He's sending her... he sends one postcard that says, it's a postcard sent to your father, I think, where he begs the baby to let his mother sleep.
Yes,
and it's
that's
just
the little one there where he's on stilts.
If you could imagine how and how time is unfolding for them in a different way. But that's another question. But just in terms of that idea of modernization and their story.
Modernization, their story, well, that is a huge subject. But of course, when you're thinking of a person born in 1864 and the Franco-Prussian War ends in 1870-71, and the Paris Commune is put down brutally in 1871, and Napoleon III comes into power, and because of all the disease and the cholera and the plague in Paris, because of the lack of sewage and drainage, etc., no fresh water, Baron Haussmann is enlisted to modernize and rebuild the city of Paris and tear down the only lasting old quarter is the Marais, apparently. And so, yes, so when you think of a young family in Paris at that time, when all that ferment is taking place, and it's not only a cultural revolution, it's an urban planning revolution, and the intention really was, as I gather from my limited knowledge of the history, and I need to know a lot more, that Napoleon III and Haussmann were deliberately making this the most beautiful city in the world and the cultural capital of the world. But as you said, to realize those founding ideals of the French Revolution, that everything had to be done for the common good. And the common good was composed of two things: public health and safety, and education. Something that, I did send you that Ideas podcast that was put on. Do you all follow the CBC Ideas broadcast? There was a two-part series called The Sewers of Paris. And it was absolutely entrancing and folds into this really well, because it became clear that those great big Haussmannian boulevards that define Paris for us today, they're actually built on top of the sewer system. And that's what defines the boulevards. First it's the sewers, and then it's the boulevards. And as you said, some of the postcards on the verso are really photographs of that process of the rebuilding of Paris. And we have to get them all scanned in order to really examine that. But my intuition tells me that he would troll the banks of the Seine, the booksellers, and buy up these penny numbers, these cheap industrial postcards that had scenes from the Louvre, scenes from Paris, the excavation of the metro station at Denfert-Rochereau, and of course the invention of cement at that time, or the redevelopment of cement as a building material that made the sewage system possible.
And it's interesting to think that they would show construction sites on the reverse of these postcards. They weren't showing finished, realized sites yet.
They were showing it in process.
So it's very, as a method for disseminating this change in the city and making it visible to others what the project of Napoleon III and Haussmann was, making that, because I would imagine that the way that the postcard circulated was also as a messaging system.
Of course it was,
So
yes, exactly. And a propaganda system. I mean, again, part of that propaganda to ensure that the world knew Paris was the place to be then. And that's where all the best things were going to be happening.
Yeah, 1,500-year-old city. So if you can imagine what we go through in terms of any small change to an urban plan, this was a big,
huge
undertaking
for
monumental. Them to basically rebuild that entire urban plan, not just an individual piece of architecture.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because as you describe your family, I think it's a family that is, sounds like an upper middle class family, a family of great education and means. They would have been amongst the quarter that previously would have received very good sewage, where the other parts of the city did not have the same kind of infrastructure. So it's really interesting to think about how that plays out in terms of how a class structure emerges as well in terms of those kind of systems of care, and what starts to emerge in terms of, making a corrective, as we were talking about earlier with the revolution.
Yeah.
So he is, actually you were going to read something.
Yeah, should I read a few little things?
Yeah.
Is this making any sense to you at all, or is it all confabulation? Who knows? Just a few things from my father's memoirs, and he didn't have anybody proof them, obviously. Of my maternal grandfather, whom I knew, all I can say is that he was an engineer in the Ponts et Chaussées. That's the bridges and highways, the French department that built and maintained the roads and bridges of France. That as a little boy I attended his funeral in 1919 in Paris, which was attended by a military guard of honor. And that is about all. There is in my room an old photograph showing my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my grandmother with my own father on her lap. I remember my grandmother vaguely, being nearly 5 years old when she passed away. My father drew a picture of her on her deathbed on the back cover of my mother's hymn book. And apparently my sister Marguerite in Montreal has that now. Although our family on the male side originates from Normandy, and then back before that, the Haute-Savoie, because I found the founding document of our family, the sheepskin dated 1455, signed by the King of France at that time, not giving them naturalization papers. The Savoie at that time probably belonged to Italy. Originates from Normandy. My grandfather of French Flanders was born in Lille, in French Flanders. I know he was at college in Arras, Picardy, and being a law student was spared the normal length of military service of 7 years, and did only 1 year. And then he goes on to compare his military service to his father's. As is obvious by the many drawings left by my father, his sculpture of Eric Coupey, my cousin, and that's Eric Coupey Sr., and Eric Coupey Jr., my cousin, has that one in San Francisco. His painting of my mother, there's only one oil painting that he did. His inclinations, his literary and cultural interests, his correspondence to me, his sense of the practical was minimal. So in my father's eyes, he was not a very good businessman, and in fact takes credit for getting him his first job as a lawyer 2 years before he dies. Despite his study of law and his obtention of the necessary diplomas, he never attempted the bar examinations, and it was only in the last 2 years of his life that he finally put his knowledge to practical use, etc., working for a law firm that advised American divorcees who had married into the French nobility how to get as much money as they could out of it. Anyway, that's another story. But my grandmother's story is, I think, pertinent to what you were asking before, because how do people's life conditions change in different urban settings? And why was it important to the family at that time to have a house with indoor plumbing? Because she came from a rough background. It would be completely remiss of me at this juncture not to say something of my mother, because after all, Kate is the focus and the epicenter of this story, really. And not to say something of my mother. Although my willful nature and my brutal temper must have been a torment to her at times, I deeply admired her and very much loved her. I'll skip. My mother herself had had a rough time of it. When very young, her father disappeared suddenly, leaving his maternal grandfather, very much a lady, with 3 daughters and a son, at a time when practically no employment, unless the most menial, was available to a woman. The only solution was immediate deprivation, and I remember my mother telling me of many evening meals being merely bread soaked in water. Eventually, my grandmother, whom I saw quite often when coming to visit us from England, was able to place my mother with some distant relatives in Sussex. And it goes on about that and how difficult it was
And
for...
that's Kate.
That's
and
Kate,
Karine.
yeah. Kate
Yeah.
and Karine, yes, yeah. Digressing too much?
No,
No?
it's lovely. I also think, I wonder if people have questions at this point, actually.
Should I just read one more little passage? Yeah, because we can't go on forever, but I'll just read something from my uncle's memoirs of his father. I was the last born. I had a brother who was 7 years older and 2 sisters. We lived happily, for in that gentle epoch, it was la belle époque, one did not need to be rich to be happy and find happiness. We naturally spoke French with our friends and everyone in the area, but at home we had no problem sliding from French to English. Or rather, if we spoke little English, we understood it perfectly. My father was a man of great culture and learning. He was a doctor of law, Bachelor of Arts, and had obtained the first prize for violin from the Conservatory of Paris. He spoke 7 languages fluently, and at that time such a stack of qualifications was most rare. He was born in 1864, but he was a man with a high moral code, as opposed to his brother Évariste. And that's one story I just wanted to touch on. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. And who never transgressed his personal ethics. Thus, he had always refused to exercise his true profession, which was that of a lawyer. Thus, he had always, for he said that one cannot condemn evil and defend it at the same time without a great deal of hypocrisy. He only went back to his profession at the end of his life when he became lawyer counselor for Americans in Paris. A career as a prefect had also been offered to him, but it involved political compromises of which he felt himself incapable. In return for this, we stayed poor, but very happy. He died at 61 years old from a stupid accident while returning from a concert practice. Well, this is part of the story that I just wanted to relate now, if I can. I hope I'm not taking too much time.
No, I think we're good.
Is that my grandfather, Léon, because he had a law degree, was offered a post to teach law at the University of Prague. His brother, his younger brother, Évariste, being something of having a different moral code from my grandfather's, if I can put it that way, stole all his diplomas, his degrees, his correspondence, and presented himself in his place at the University of Prague. And I have a feeling that there might be some element of, when I see his self-portraits, I see him with his eyes down, And I see a certain kind of melancholy and a certain kind of introspection. They're not really depicting a person absolutely kicking up his heels and having a great time at this moment. He's thinking. And I'm wondering if in the later postcards and self-portraits, he isn't somewhat thinking of this kind of change in trajectory for his family and for his brother's family. Because Évariste did present himself at the University of Prague, taught successfully, and my grandfather, he was a great con man. And there's that whole strain in our family where you have on the one side so-called integrity, and then really good con men. And my grandfather never exposed it and never claimed the position, let him get away with it, and apparently, according to my father, just simply never spoke to him again. But at the same time, Kate and Corinne were still sisters. And Eric Coupey Sr., who was born in Prague, was actually, his birth was registered in my grandfather's name. So there are all kinds of little things going back and forth. So the postcards tell some of the story, and they may hint at many other layers to the stories, but it'll take us a little while longer to excavate those stories and really begin to piece out what we can, and perhaps we'll never know all of it. Sorry if I babbled on too long.
Wonderful. It'll be so interesting to see what comes of this public display of these cards, and as the stories come out, even in terms of the proximity historically, like what were the things that would inform a choice like that to present yourself as another? It's such an interesting thing that we could never get away with now. Like really, in a surveillance technology that we have now,
well,
it would be very difficult.
Very difficult.
I think.
Very difficult, yes. Well, when you come back to the title of the show, personne, and persona, I mean, clearly he was speaking through a mask, the mask of his brother, and capable of speaking very well in the mask of his brother. He didn't have the law degree, etc. But the portraits may show a mask of one kind. I mean, everything that we do, everything that we speak, is he's speaking through a kind of a mask.
He makes a mask of one of the postcards too, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
We didn't show this one, but it's a cutout. The eyes are cut out of that postcard.
Exactly.
And that one goes through the mail. But how interesting, in light of what you've just said.
Yes,
that,
it's literally a mask.
Yeah, something that he could have worn as a mask.
And relates to the kinds of masks that we have here. Anyway, just a little
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that there are questions about this series. That is simply a small introduction of what is just a fascinating collection. We're going to take about 10 minutes to take questions. If you want to have a moment to get something to drink, we're going to go straight through all of the 3 interviews and conversations today. So please, during the question period, take a moment if you need to get something to drink, and we'll take questions.
I was wondering if you've got any sense of what he would be looking at in terms of books and magazines, even. Like he seems to have it seems to be like a compendium of illustration, which is what I find so fascinating. I'm wondering if you knew what he was looking at or interested in.
Well, as we said, apparently he did speak 7 languages, and he was fluent in Latin, and he passed down also a collection of incunabula. I gave a lot of that to my nephew Karim, because he was very much in love with those books. But these are Latin sheepskin books, handwritten, blah, 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 before printing. And so he was obviously, interested in that. It is a question, he was also a writer. My father complains in one of his notes to me that he doesn't know who erased his father's poetry. And I saw some of the poetry and in French, and I wasn't too knocked out by that. I'm more knocked out by the drawings, and I wish I could have heard him play the violin. He certainly played better than my father did. But it is a question that I'm asking myself, because in one of these postcards you have, in the right-hand set, in the bottom left-hand corner, you have his confabulation of the of Montparnasse, Montmartre, and is it Montparnasse or Montmartre? Where's Sacré-Cœur? It's on Montmartre. Montmartre, that's right. And it's a kind of a surrealist drawing of the hill. And the Légende on the side documents all the establishments, the Moulin Rouge, the Lapin Agile, the Bateau Lavoir. So I keep on asking myself, how familiar would he have been with what Monet was doing, with what Manet was doing, what Degas was doing? Certainly he's, moving around Paris and, in places where they would be. He clearly has spent a lot of time at the Louvre. I presume that his reading would have been, very, very Catholic, very broad. But other than that, I don't know for sure. But I really would love to know, what was he looking at? Somebody remarked that one of the self-portraits is very Gauguin-esque, and it does have that kind of feeling. And I get feelings of traces of, the pastels of Degas and what have you. But what exactly?
Some of the comic postcards remind me of old comic postcards that I've seen in Paris, actually.
Oh, really?
The comic postcard, it's like dead drop, something I've seen.
Oh, I wish I knew that.
Those too.
Probably, yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Going on back then.
Yeah.
Sure.
You've given me another avenue to research. Yes, you better be. Yeah, the severed head. He has a lot of guillotine ones as well, usually with his head. No idea. I was trying to recall with Keith earlier, what is the biblical story? It's Herod and Salome. Salome. But whose head is severed? Is it John the Baptist? That's right. So I was right on that. Yeah. A martyrdom? Who knows? A joke. He was full of wit. I mean, when you do read some of the postcards and some of the satirical drawings, he did have a droll wit, and he was poking fun. He obviously didn't take himself too seriously. Yeah.
Well, it's really lovely to hear the stories, and because Tim Wilborn's here, I thought, just team up. You have the factual stuff and the anecdotal stuff, and then he can do the fictions.
Oh, okay.
Write a book that reads this fictional and factual, because no one can make up what you just said.
Yeah.
That's I think it's a book. I think it's a novel set against a true historical framework of a family.
Yeah, I wish Ondaatje would take it up. I'm gonna,
Postcards in the publication.
Well, that would be another direction. What we're thinking of more is more academic book, and forget that. And somebody else was suggesting that I should incorporate them into my paintings and do a kind of collaboration with them, and appropriate them. But yeah, there are different possibilities and directions we could go in. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Well, let's take a little 5-minute
Sure.
break, and then
Yeah.
but thank you so much, Pierre, for sharing that history with us.
Well, thank you.